I'm sorry, Mrs. Sharma. Could you please come into the principal's office for just a moment? The young man collecting school fees smiled as he said it. It wasn't the polite smile of someone behind a counter. It was the smile of someone who already knew something I didn't. I looked down at the receipt in my hand. Is there a problem? I asked. He shook his head. No, ma'am, nothing to worry about. My husband, Rajiv, checked his watch. I'll just move the car, he said casually. They're asking everyone to clear the entrance. I'll be back in 2 minutes. I nodded without thinking. As soon as he walked outside, the employee lowered his voice. Please come in, ma'am. I followed him through the narrow hallway toward the principal's office, wondering why a simple school fee payment suddenly felt so serious. I had no idea that the next few minutes would quietly expose a truth my husband had been hiding from everyone, including me. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. People who meet me today usually assume my life has always been comfortable. They see a woman who speaks calmly, dresses simply but well, owns a successful education consultancy, and somehow always seems prepared. They don't see the girl who spent the first 16 years of her life believing she was an inconvenience. My name is Ananya Sharma. I am 38 years old, and I have learned that some families don't insult you loudly. They simply build a version of the world where your value is always slightly smaller than everyone else's. That difference is difficult to notice when you're young. It becomes impossible to ignore when you're older. I grew up in Kanpur in a 2-bedroom apartment where every square foot had a purpose. My father worked for the irrigation department for 32 years. My mother taught mathematics at a government school. Neither of them was cruel. Neither of them was especially affectionate either. Everything in our house revolved around practicality. My older brother, Nitin, was considered the future. I was considered dependable. At first, those labels seemed harmless. Only later did I realize they shaped every decision. When there was enough money for one coaching class, it went to Nitin. When there was one new bicycle, it went to Nitin. When relatives asked about dreams, they asked him what he wanted to become. When they turned toward me, the question changed. Can you make everyone some tea? It sounds insignificant. One sentence. One request. Repeated hundreds of times. Eventually, a child stops expecting different questions. I became very good at observing people because speaking rarely changed anything. By class 10, I ranked first in my district with 96.4%. The newspaper printed my photograph. For exactly 1 day, everyone congratulated me. On the second day, conversations returned to my brother's engineering entrance preparation. That wasn't because my parents loved me less. It was because they genuinely believed investing in a son produced greater security for the family. Looking back, I understand their logic. I simply don't agree with it. The memory that has stayed with me happened when I was 11. My school organized a science exhibition. I built a working model of a rainwater harvesting system using cardboard, transparent pipes, and a small motor my physics teacher found in the laboratory. I won first prize. The trophy wasn't expensive. It probably cost less than 400 rupees. I carried it home carefully. My father smiled. Very nice. Then he pointed toward the dining table. Keep it there, guests are coming tonight. When everyone arrived, my brother demonstrated his new calculator, while my trophy stayed behind a flower vase because it made the table look crowded. Nobody intended to hurt me. Nobody even noticed. That was the lesson. Sometimes people don't erase your achievements. They simply fail to make space for them. Years later, I would experience that exact feeling again. Only the trophy would be much larger. And the room much quieter. I studied commerce, earned scholarships every year, completed my MBA with university distinction, and accepted a campus placement with a consulting firm in Gurgaon. Starting salary, Rupee 42,000 a month. For my family, it sounded impressive. For me, it was freedom. Within 5 years, I had received 4 promotions. By 30, I managed a team of 26 analysts and projects worth more than 18 crore annually. Numbers made sense to me. People were more complicated. That was where Rajiv entered my life. He was charming in a very ordinary way. He remembered birthdays. He listened without interrupting. He laughed with his eyes before he laughed aloud. We met during a corporate leadership workshop. He worked in banking. He wasn't the loudest person in the room. He was the person everyone naturally trusted. After 2 years, we married. His family welcomed me warmly. At least that's what I believed. His mother, Sushila, was 62. She believed respect was demonstrated through routine. Tea at 6, dinner at 8. Phone calls every Sunday. She never raised her voice. Instead, she organized everyone's lives so efficiently that disagreement felt almost rude. His father, Mahesh, had retired from the railways. He admired discipline above everything else. He measured character through punctuality, savings, and silence. Then there was Rajiv's younger sister, Neha. Bright, funny, creative. She had changed careers 3 times before turning 30. My in-laws described that as courage. If I changed my plans, they called it impulsive. The standards were subtle. Always subtle. Never enough to justify an argument. Just enough to create exhaustion. When my consultancy business began, almost nobody believed it would succeed. Including Rajiv's. Not because he lacked faith in me. Because he genuinely believed stable employment was safer than entrepreneurship. His advice always sounded reasonable. Maybe wait another year. Maybe build more savings. Maybe keep your job. Reasonable advice can delay extraordinary decisions for years. Fortunately, I ignored him. The first year my business earned rupee 18 lakh. The second year rupee 47 lakh. By the 5th year our annual revenue crossed rupee 2 crore. We employed 21 people. Students from 11 countries worked with us. More than 3,000 families had trusted us with university admissions. The company became known in education circles. At home, very little changed. During family gatherings, I was still introduced as, "This is Ananya, she helps students." Not, "She built a national consultancy." Language reveals priorities. People rarely notice. I always did. Our daughter Meera entered class for the year everything changed. She inherited Rajiv's patience and my habit of observing quietly. She noticed details adults ignored. One evening, she asked me a question that stayed in my mind. "Mama, why do Dadu and Daddy clap louder for everyone else?" Children don't exaggerate. They report. I smiled and changed the subject. But I knew exactly what she meant. When Neha completed a 6-week design course, everyone celebrated. When my company won an industry award, dinner continued almost normally. No one was malicious. They simply had different expectations of different people. Recognition follows expectation. That pattern would eventually collide with reality in the most unexpected place imaginable. Not in my office. Not at an awards ceremony. But at my daughter's school, while paying a routine fee that almost made me question everything I believed about the people closest to me. I followed the young employee through the corridor with slow, measured steps. Schools have a particular silence in the middle of the morning. Not complete silence. Just layers of distant sounds. A bell ringing somewhere upstairs. Children reciting multiplication tables behind closed classroom doors. The squeak of polished shoes on the tiled floor. The faint hum of ceiling fans that had probably been there for 20 years. The employee walked confidently, but every few seconds he glanced back to make sure I was still following. That made me even more curious. "Are you sure everything is all right?" I asked again. He smiled politely. Yes, ma'am. Nothing more. People often think curiosity comes from wanting answers. Sometimes it comes from noticing what people deliberately choose not to say. We stopped outside the principal's office. The brass nameplate reflected the morning sunlight. He knocked gently. A voice answered from inside. Please come. The employee opened the door and stepped aside. Ma'am. I entered. The principal, Mrs. Fernandez, stood immediately. She had always carried herself with calm confidence. In 6 years at the school, I had never seen her look surprised by anything. Today, however, she looked unusually pleased. Mrs. Sharma, she said warmly, extending both hands toward me, thank you for coming. I smiled politely. I hope everything is all right. It is more than all right. She gestured toward a chair. Please sit. I remained standing. If this is about Mira. She interrupted gently. No. A brief silence followed. Then she looked toward the young employee. Would you close the door? The click of the door sounded louder than it should have. My mind immediately began inventing possibilities. Had Mira been selected for something? Had there been an administrative mistake? Had I forgotten to submit some document? Mrs. Fernandez folded her hands on the desk. I owe you an apology. I blinked. I'm sorry. For several years. Now I was completely confused. I'm afraid I don't understand. She took a thin folder from the desk. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, printed articles, award announcements, conference brochures. My own face looked back at me from more than one page. One clipping announced that our consultancy had helped over 1,000 students receive international admissions. Another featured an interview I had given after receiving an Education Innovation Award. A third mentioned our scholarship foundation. I stared at the folder, then back at her. She smiled. I recognized your name only last week. My name? Yes. I don't understand. She laughed softly. Neither did I, until one of our trustees attended an education summit in Delhi. Now things became even stranger. Our trustee returned and asked me why I had never mentioned that one of our parents had built one of the country's fastest-growing education advisory organizations. I didn't know what to say. She continued. I told him I had no idea. That answer embarrassed her. I could see it. As principal, she said quietly, I know the professions of most parents. Doctors, lawyers, chartered accountants, entrepreneurs, somehow, I never realized who you were. I smiled awkwardly. There's nothing to apologize for. There is. She closed the folder. I made assumptions. Those 4 words stayed with me. Because they were honest. I saw a quiet parent who attended every meeting, never demanded special treatment, never introduced herself, never corrected anyone. She looked directly into my eyes. So I assumed there wasn't much to know. It wasn't an insult. It was something much more uncomfortable. It was self-awareness. Before I could answer, another knock came at the door. Mrs. Fernandez smiled. They're here. The door opened. 3 people entered. 2 men. 1 woman. All professionally dressed. I recognized only one face. Mr. Arvind Kapoor, chairman of the school's governing trust. We had met briefly at an education conference nearly 8 months earlier. He looked at me for less than 2 seconds before smiling broadly. There you are. He walked directly toward me and extended his hand. Mrs. Sharma. I stood automatically. Good morning. I've been hoping we'd finally meet properly. He shook my hand with genuine warmth. The other trustees smiled as well. One of them said, almost laughing, So this is the parent we've been hearing about. I looked toward Mrs. Fernandez. She smiled as though the surprise was finally making sense. Mr. Kapoor continued. When we reviewed potential advisors for our new career guidance initiative. He paused. Your name appeared from 3 completely independent sources. I frowned slightly. Mine? Yes. Universities recommended you. He counted on his fingers. A former education secretary recommended you. A non-profit recommended your scholarship work. And one of our alumni's parents refused to speak to anyone else. I laughed quietly. I had no idea. That, he replied, is exactly why I wanted to meet you. He placed a document on the table. Our trust manages 9 schools. I nodded. We're planning a comprehensive university and career mentoring program for students from classes 8 through 12. He looked around the room. We would like you to design it. For a moment, nobody spoke. I read the first page. Consulting partnership. 3-year term. Scholarship initiative. Teacher training. Parent counseling. Everything aligned perfectly with the work my company already specialized in. This is. I searched for words. Unexpected. Mr. Kapoor smiled. The best opportunities usually are. I took a slow breath. I'm honored. We're honored. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. We discussed student anxiety, career planning, scholarship accessibility, regional language counseling, data collection, teacher workshops. Not once did anyone ask how large my company was, or how much revenue we generated. They cared about ideas, evidence, experience. At one point, Mr. Kapoor leaned back in his chair. You know, he said thoughtfully, your presentation at the Delhi conference changed how our board thinks about counseling. I looked surprised. You attended. I sat in the 3rd row. You never introduced yourself. You were surrounded by university delegates afterward. He smiled. I assumed we'd meet eventually. Life has an unusual sense of timing. Sometimes eventually arrives while you're paying school fees. Outside, completely unaware of everything happening inside that office, Rajiv had probably parked the car and was walking back toward the administration building. Neither of us knew that the next 60 seconds would quietly change the way he looked at me forever. Rajiv wasn't the kind of man who rushed. Even when he was late, he somehow managed to look unhurried. That was one of the things I had always admired about him. As he walked back toward the administration block, he noticed the fee counter was empty. The young employee who had been collecting payments was no longer there. He looked around for me. One of the security guards pointed toward the principal's office. Madam is inside. Rajiv smiled. Oh, maybe some paperwork. He thanked the guard and started walking down the corridor. From inside the office, I was explaining how our scholarship program had evolved. In the beginning, I said, we funded only 12 students each year. Mr. Kapoor nodded. And now? Last year, 187. The woman trustee looked genuinely impressed. Without government funding. Entirely through private partnerships and alumni contributions. She wrote something in her notebook. We've been trying to build something similar. Before I could respond, there was another knock. Mrs. Fernandez looked toward the door. Come in. The door opened. Rajiv stepped halfway inside. I'm sorry, he said politely. I was just looking for my wife. He stopped. His eyes moved around the room. First to me. Then to the principal. Then to the trustees. Finally, they settled on Mr. Kapoor. Recognition appeared almost instantly. Rajiv had seen him before. Not personally. In newspapers. On television. At banking conferences. Mr. Kapoor turned. So, he smiled. You must be Mr. Sharma. Rajiv nodded slowly. Yes. He wasn't confused anymore. He was trying to understand why one of the most respected education trustees in the region knew his wife's name before knowing his. Mr. Kapoor walked over and shook his hand warmly. You've been patient. Rajiv laughed awkwardly. I didn't realize there was a meeting. It became one. Everyone chuckled. The tension dissolved. Mrs. Fernandez added another chair. Please join us. Rajiv sat beside me without saying a word. For the next 15 minutes he listened. Really listened. Not as a husband who already knew my work. As someone discovering it from complete strangers. He heard them discuss measurable outcomes. University acceptance rates. Teacher training modules. Scholarship impact reports. Long-term educational planning. One trustee said, we analyzed 6 consulting organizations before narrowing the list. Another added, Mrs. Sharma's methodology consistently produced the strongest student retention numbers. Then Mr. Kapoor looked directly at Rajiv. You must be very proud. It was an ordinary sentence. No accusation. No hidden meanings. Just genuine admiration. Rajiv smiled. I am. His answer came immediately. But I noticed something else. He didn't say it automatically. He said it after thinking. As though he was realizing the full weight of those words while speaking them. The meeting concluded with handshakes and an agreement to schedule a formal planning session the following week. Mrs. Fernandez walked us to the entrance herself. Parents waiting outside looked curious. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Simply because principals rarely escorted parents personally. The young employee who had first called me inside smiled again. This time I understood why. As we reached the parking area, Rajiv unlocked the car but didn't get in immediately. He leaned against the driver's door. Can I ask you something? Of course. How long has your company been doing all this? I smiled gently. You know how long? No. He shook his head. I knew the numbers. He paused. I didn't know the respect. There was no defensiveness in his voice. Only honesty. I've heard you talk about work for years. He looked down for a moment. I don't think I ever understood how other professionals see you. I remained quiet. Sometimes silence allows people to finish thoughts they didn't know they had. He continued. At home. He searched for the right words. Your work became normal. I nodded. I suppose it did. I got used to hearing about admissions. Scholarships. Universities. New partnerships. He smiled faintly. I stopped realizing those things weren't ordinary. That sentence explained more than an apology ever could. Familiarity has an unusual side effect. It can shrink extraordinary achievements until they look routine. Not because they become smaller. Because we stop measuring them. On the drive home, neither of us played music. Meera chatted happily from the back seat about a science experiment she'd done in class. Rajiv listened more carefully than usual. When she proudly described scoring full marks on a mathematics quiz, he turned around immediately. That's wonderful. She beamed. Then he looked at me. Almost instinctively. I knew exactly what he was remembering. A little girl carrying a science trophy that nobody made room for. He didn't know that story. I had never told him. Yet somehow the expression on his face suggested he understood it anyway. That evening after dinner, my in-laws came over for tea. It was one of our regular Thursday gatherings. Nothing about the routine had changed. Except us. Sushila asked casually. How was the fee payment? Rajiv answered before I could. It turned into a meeting with the school trustees. His mother looked surprised. They want Ananya to design a career guidance program for all their schools. Mahesh adjusted his glasses. All their schools. 9 campuses. There was a brief silence. Neha looked toward me. I didn't know they were planning something that large. I didn't either, I replied honestly. Rajiv smiled. They specifically requested her. Again silence. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Mahesh finally spoke. That's significant. It was probably the highest compliment he had ever given me. Simple. Measured. Sincere. Sushila asked several questions. Not out of suspicion. Out of genuine curiosity. How many students did we help each year? How large was the team now? How would the project work? For the first time in many years, nobody interrupted my answers. Nobody changed the subject halfway through. Nobody summarized my work as helping students. They listened. Quietly. Attentively. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Families don't change overnight. Patterns don't disappear because of one afternoon. But something subtle had shifted. A door had opened. Not because I had demanded recognition. Because recognition had arrived from people whose opinions carried undeniable weight. Ironically, I hadn't sought validation. Yet its arrival forced everyone else to reconsider what had been in front of them all along. The days that followed were strangely ordinary. There were no emotional family meetings. No dramatic apologies. No promises that everything would be different from now on. Real life rarely offers scenes like that. Instead, it offers small moments. And if you pay attention, those moments tell you whether people are actually changing. The following Monday, I left home at 7:30 for our first planning session with the school trust. As I picked up my laptop bag, Rajiv walked into the kitchen. I've already packed your charger, he said. I looked at him surprised. You remembered. He smiled. You always forget it before important meetings. He was right. For 9 years, I had forgotten my charger before almost every major presentation. He had noticed. He had simply never mentioned it. That morning he did. It wasn't about the charger. It was about attention. The meeting lasted nearly 5 hours. Representatives from all 9 campuses attended. There were principals, counselors, senior teachers, psychologists, and administrative directors. Instead of introducing me with a list of qualifications, Mr. Kapoor simply said, "Today we're here to learn from someone who has spent more than a decade helping families make some of the most important decisions of their lives." Then he handed me the microphones. For the next 3 hours, nobody checked their phones. Nobody interrupted. We discussed why students often chose careers based on family expectations rather than personal strengths. We analyzed anonymous data from more than 11,000 counseling sessions my company had conducted over 8 years. We compared admission outcomes across different mentoring models. Every recommendation I made was supported by numbers. Not opinions. At the end of the presentation, one principal stood up. I've attended educational workshops for 23 years, she said. This is the first time I felt someone explain parents as carefully as they explain students. That sentence meant more to me than any award. Because she understood the real work. Education was never only about children. It was about the adults making decisions around them. Meanwhile, something else was happening at home. Almost without realizing it, Rajiv had started talking about my work differently. One evening his colleague called. Their conversation drifted toward careers. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply happened to be in the next room. His colleague asked, "So what does your wife do these days?" For years, Rajiv had answered almost automatically. She runs an education consultancy. This time he said something different. She founded one of the largest independent university counseling organizations in our region. I stopped folding the laundry. He continued, They've helped thousands of students and recently partnered with a major school trust. There was pride in his voice. Not exaggerated pride. Accurate pride. Sometimes respect changes first in private conversations, long before it becomes visible anywhere else. My in-laws changed differently. Mahesh became curious. Every Sunday he asked one practical question. How many counselors work with you now? How do scholarships get funded? Do universities contact you directly? He wasn't trying to flatter me. He was trying to understand. That mattered more. Sushila changed through habit. Whenever relatives visited, she began introducing me differently. This is our daughter-in-law Ananya. A pause. She built her own education company. The first time she said it, she almost stumbled over the sentence, as though she was learning a new language. After a few months, it sounded natural. Language creates reality. The words people repeat eventually become the truth they believe. Neha surprised me the most. One afternoon she called unexpectedly. Are you free for coffee? We met at a small cafe halfway between our offices. She stirred her cappuccino for nearly a minute before speaking. Can I ask you something honestly? Always. Did you ever feel? She hesitated. That we underestimated you. I smiled gently. Why are you asking? Because I think we did. There was no self-defense in her voice. Only reflection. I kept thinking about that day at Mira's school. She looked out the window. It wasn't that strangers respected you. It was how naturally they respected you. She laughed quietly. They already knew who you were. I waited. I realized something uncomfortable. What? I always thought success announces itself. She shook her head. Yours didn't. It just kept growing quietly, while the rest of us kept assuming we already understood your life. I reached across the table and touched her hand. We all do that. She looked at me. Even you. Especially me. She smiled. What do you mean? I assumed my family would eventually notice without me saying anything. I laughed softly. That was my mistake. People cannot appreciate what they never truly see. Not because they don't care. Because familiarity makes observation lazy. 6 months later, the school trust's program officially launched. It covered every campus. More than 8,400 students. Nearly 600 teachers. Thousands of parents. The opening ceremony included local educators, university representatives, and community leaders. I expected to sit somewhere in the audience until my presentation. Instead, Mr. Kapoor walked onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. We often celebrate buildings, he said. We celebrate rankings. We celebrate examination results. He paused. But today we are celebrating guidance. He turned toward me. The future changes when students receive better advice. He invited me onto the stage. The applause lasted much longer than I expected. As I looked across the auditorium, I noticed my family sitting together in the third row. Rajiv, Meera, my in-laws, Neha. None of them were looking at their phones. None of them were whispering. They were simply watching. For years, I had imagined what recognition might feel like. I assumed it would be loud, triumphant, victorious. Instead, it felt remarkably peaceful. Because I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong anymore. I was simply standing in a place I had already earned. Recognition hadn't created my worth. It had only made it visible. And that, I realized, is a very different thing. The older I get, the more I believe families operate like invisible systems. Not machines, not traditions, systems. Each person is quietly assigned a role. The responsible one. The successful one. The funny one. The difficult one. The dependable one. Once those roles settle into place, people stop collecting new evidence. They continue reacting to old assumptions. That's why some children remain the quiet one, even after becoming leaders. That's why some adults remain the irresponsible one, years after changing completely. And that's why genuine recognition often arrives first from strangers. Strangers evaluate your present. Families sometimes keep evaluating your past. Neither group is entirely right. Neither is entirely wrong. The healthiest relationships are the ones willing to update their understanding. My family eventually did. Not perfectly. Not immediately. But sincerely. Looking back now, I don't remember the receipt I carried into the school office. I don't remember the amount of the fee. I don't even remember what I was wearing. I remember a young employee smiling and saying, "Madam, please come in." At the time, I thought he was leading me into an administrative discussion. In reality, he was leading me into one of the quietest turning points of my life. Not because strangers praised me, but because the people I loved finally had the chance to see me through someone else's eyes. And sometimes that is the kind of justice that lasts the longest. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment when strangers recognized your value before your own family did? I'd love to read your story. Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. The story could have ended there. Most people would probably choose that ending. Recognition. A successful partnership. A family that slowly began seeing what had always been there. It would have made for a satisfying conclusion. Except life doesn't stop after the moment everyone applauds. Real change is tested later. Usually in situations so ordinary that nobody realizes they're important. About 8 months after the school partnership began, my father called unexpectedly. He almost never phoned during working hours. "Are you busy?" "A little. Is everything all right? Can you come to Kanpur this weekend?" His voice sounded unusually hesitant. "Of course. I need your opinion about something." For a second, I thought I had misheard him. Growing up, my father rarely asked for my opinion. He asked whether I had finished my homework, whether I had locked the front door, whether I had informed someone if I would be late. But advice, that usually belonged to someone else. "What happened?" I asked. "It's easier to explain in person." When Rajiv and I reached my parents' home that Saturday, very little had changed. The same cream-coloured walls. The same neem tree outside the balcony. The same old clock in the drawing room that had been 5 minutes fast for as long as I could remember. Some things survive decades without needing improvement. My mother hugged Mira tightly. My father smiled, then disappeared into his study. After lunch he called me inside. On the table were 3 files. A calculator. A notebook filled with handwritten figures. "I've been helping a few retired colleagues manage their savings," he said. I nodded. He had always enjoyed numbers. "They want to create a small educational trust." I looked up. "For scholarships?" "Yes. They've collected about 1.8 crore. He hesitated. "We don't know how to structure it." I waited. Then came a sentence I never expected to hear. "I thought you might know." Not because I was his daughter. Because I was the most qualified person in the room. There was a difference. A quiet but profound difference. We spent almost 4 hours discussing governance, transparency, application procedures, auditing standards, and long-term sustainability. Every suggestion I made, my father wrote down carefully. Not once did he interrupt. Not once did he explain why his way might be better. When we finished, he closed the notebook. "You've learned things I never had the opportunity to learn." It wasn't an apology. It was respect. Coming from him, that was enough. That evening, my mother and I washed dishes together. She suddenly smiled. You know what? When you were little, you always asked why we trusted your brother to fix things. I laughed. I remember. You were angry. I was. She rinsed a plate slowly. I thought confidence came from giving responsibility to the child who looked strongest. She looked at me. I didn't realize confidence also comes from receiving responsibility. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she added quietly, I wish I had understood that sooner. Parents rarely receive manuals. Most are simply repeating what they experience themselves. Understanding that doesn't erase old hurt. But it does make forgiveness easier. A month later, something happened that made me smile more than any award ceremony ever had. Mira came home from school carrying a small certificate. Third prize. Creative writing competition. She wasn't upset. She wasn't overly excited either. She simply placed it on the dining table. Before anyone said a word, Rajiv stood up. Wait. He walked to the living room cabinet. Moved aside a decorative vase. Cleared the center shelf completely. Then he placed her certificate there. This belongs where everyone can see it. Mira's face lit up. She hugged him without saying anything. Across the room, our eyes met. He smiled. He knew. Without ever hearing the story about my science trophy, he had somehow rewritten it. Not for me. For our daughter. That was how cycles ended. Not through speeches. Through different choices. One ordinary moment at a time. Years passed. The partnership with the school trust expanded from 9 campuses to 14. The Scholarship Foundation crossed an important milestone. 10,000 students had received free counseling. More than 1,200 had received direct financial assistance for higher education. Those numbers looked impressive in annual reports. To me, they were names. Faces. Parents sitting across from my desk, wondering how they would pay for a dream that seemed just out of reach. Success changes your calendar. It shouldn't change your memory. I reminded myself of that constantly. Every Friday afternoon, I blocked 2 hours that no assistant was allowed to schedule. Those hours belonged to students who could not afford our services. No publicity. No photographs. No social media posts. Just conversations. One Friday, a young girl walked into my office with her mother. She reminded me so much of myself at 16 that I had to look away for a second. Quiet. Alert. Holding a file so carefully it looked as though dropping it would erase years of hard work. Her mother apologized 3 times before sitting down. We know your consultation fee. She hesitated. We can't manage it. I smiled. Today isn't about fees. The girl finally looked up. Her marks were extraordinary. Her confidence wasn't. That combination is more common than people think. For 90 minutes we talked. Not just about universities. About fear. About being the first person in a family to dream differently. About guilt. About ambition. As they prepared to leave, the girl's mother folded her hands. How can we thank you? You already have. She looked confused. You trusted me. After they left, I sat quietly for several minutes. Years ago, someone had made room for my future. A teacher. A mentor. A scholarship committee. None of them knew what would happen later. They simply believed possibility deserved a chance. Now it was my turn. One evening, Rajiv and I were organizing old documents. Insurance papers. Medical records. Expired warranties. The sort of paperwork every family promises to organize next weekend. A faded newspaper clipping slipped out of an old folder. My district-topping result. The same photograph from when I was 16. The edges had turned yellow. The paper felt fragile. Rajiv picked it up carefully. I've never seen this. I didn't even know we still had it. He studied the photograph. You look exactly like Mira. I laughed. She gets that from my side. He looked at the article again. Then at me. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you brought this home, I knew what he was going to ask. And were you disappointed? I answered honestly. A little. Did you ever tell anyone? No. Why not? I thought for a long moment. Because children don't always know they're allowed to ask for recognition. He nodded slowly. That sentence stayed with both of us. The next Sunday, our entire family gathered for lunch. Nothing unusual. Simple food. Too many conversations happening at once. Halfway through the meal, Mahesh stood up. He tapped his glass lightly with a spoon. Everyone looked at him. I'd like to say something. That alone surprised us. He wasn't a man who enjoyed speaking in front of people. He looked at me. When Ananya joined our family. He paused. I believed consistency mattered more than achievement. He smiled faintly. I still believe consistency matters. A few people laughed. But over the years I've learned something. He turned toward Mira. Children watch how adults recognize effort. Then he looked back at everyone. If we celebrate only the achievements we expect. He shook his head gently. We miss the ones that surprise us. Silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. He sat down. There was no applause. No emotional scene. Lunch simply continued. Yet somehow it felt different. His words had quietly become part of our family's culture. People began asking more questions. Listening a little longer. Celebrating things they might once have overlooked. That was enough. Real transformation rarely announces itself. It reveals itself through repetition. A year later, Mira had to complete a school assignment. The topic was simple. Write about the person you admire most. Rajiv assumed she would choose her favorite scientist. I thought she might write about her class teacher. Instead, she handed us the finished essay after dinner. The first sentence read, "The person I admire most is my mother, because she helps people believe in themselves before they believe in her." I had spoken at conferences attended by thousands. I had accepted awards on brightly lit stages. None of those moments affected me the way that single sentence did. Because children notice the things we never realize we're teaching. She hadn't written about revenue, or recognition, or partnerships. She had written about belief. Somehow that was what she had seen. Not my achievements. My habits. I considered that the greatest compliment of my life. Looking back now, whenever someone asks me what changed after that day at the school office, I don't talk about contracts or awards. I tell them something much simpler. Recognition did not make me more successful. It made the people around me more observant. Those are two completely different things. My work had already existed. My values had already existed. My effort had already existed. What changed was the willingness of others to see them. And once people truly see you, they often begin seeing themselves differently as well. That young employee probably forgot our conversation before the end of his shift. For him, inviting a parent into the principal's office was just another task. He never knew that one polite sentence, "Madam, please come in," became the doorway to one of the most meaningful chapters of my life. Sometimes history doesn't announce itself with dramatic music or impossible coincidences. Sometimes it begins with a smile, a closed office door, and a family slowly learning that love is strongest when it keeps making room for new versions of the people it thought it already knew. Several years later, something happened that completed the circle in a way I could never have planned. Mira was in class 11. Tall enough to borrow my jackets. confident enough to challenge my opinions, kind enough to apologize when she realized she was wrong. Watching your child become an adult is a strange experience. You don't notice it all at once. You notice it in moments. The way they speak to waiters. The way they comfort a friend. The questions they ask. One Saturday morning, she walked into my study carrying a notebook. "Mama, I need your help." I smiled. "That's dangerous, those words usually lead to 3 hours of work." She laughed. "Our school has invited parents for Career Inspiration Week." "That's nice." They asked me to nominate someone. I assumed she wanted suggestions. "A scientist." "No, an entrepreneur." She shook her head. "The doctor." "No." She closed the notebook and looked directly at me. "I nominated you." I blinked. "Me." They accepted. "When is it?" "Next Friday." She grinned. "You have 45 minutes. I laughed. "That's very little notice." "I knew you'd say yes." "You sound unusually confident." She shrugged. "I've watched you prepare people for interviews for 15 years. You'll manage." The auditorium looked smaller than I remembered. Perhaps because this time I wasn't nervous. Students filled the seats. Parents occupied the back rows. Teachers stood along the walls. As I waited backstage, the principal handed me a printed program. The title beneath my name made me smile. Guest speaker, Mrs. Ananya Sharma, founder, education strategist, parent. Parent. It was listed after my professional titles. Yet somehow it felt like the most important one. When my name was announced, Mira was sitting in the second row. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't whispering to her friends. She simply smiled. The same quiet smile I had seen on Rajiv years earlier, outside the principal's office. I spoke about careers. But mostly I spoke about identity. I told the students that success is not something you discover. It is something you build through thousands of ordinary decisions that nobody applauds. I told parents that encouragement and expectation are not the same thing. Children need both. One without the other creates either pressure or comfort. Neither creates growth. Near the end, a student raised his hand. "What if your own family doesn't believe in your dream?" The room became very still. I answered carefully. Sometimes families need evidence before they offer confidence. I paused. Don't hate them for that. But don't wait forever for their permission either. You may have to become the evidence first. No one clapped immediately. People were thinking. That silence meant more than applause. After the event ended, students lined up with questions. Parents introduced themselves. Teachers asked for resources. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the same young employee who had collected school fees years ago walked toward me. Except he wasn't so young anymore. He recognized me instantly. "Mrs. Sharma." I smiled. "I know that."